To the program, Canada's most irreverent talk show here, the Andrew Lawton Show. Rather bizarre, yet not really surprising tweet I saw over the weekend by Richard Dawkins. Now, Richard Dawkins, very well known. He's an atheist, a skeptic. He's a professor. He's an author. He has written a lot about why he believes people that believe in God are stupid, specifically Christians. He seems to have a greater objection to than others. And someone sent him a message on Twitter, posted a question to him on Twitter, asking him about aborting a fetus with Down syndrome, an unborn child with the genetic makeup of those who have Down syndrome. And people all the time will tweet him, their thoughts and whatever, and he's active on Twitter. He responds to people. He engages that way. But his response was shocking, even knowing what he believed. And what we see here is a tweeter who said to him, "I honestly don't know what I would do if I were pregnant with a kid with Down syndrome, real ethical dilemma." He responded with this, quote, "Abort it and try again. It would be immoral to bring it into the world if you have the choice," unquote. So not only does Dawkins say that he believes it's acceptable to abort based on a child having Down syndrome, but that he believes it is a moral imperative, that you are making a mistake or doing a disservice by not aborting it. The ultimate irony is here, as someone who claims to be proudly pro-choice, denying women the choice to carry a baby to term. Joining me on the line is Jonathon Van Maren, Communications Director for the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform. Jonathon, great to have you on the show as always, sir.
Thanks, Andrew.
So what was your response when you saw this tweet? I mean, because I know and you know his position, but this to me just it shocked me. It did.
Well, at first, I wasn't really surprised because, as you say, he's been tweeting a lot of bizarre things lately. He tried to tweet about mild pedophilia, whatever that is, a while ago, and then made some bumbling references to state rape later on. So this tweet is sort of another one in a long succession of really strange things that he's been saying on Twitter lately. But I actually tweeted back at him a bunch of times when that initial tweet came out. And he refused to respond because what I said was, like, aren't you taking a very eugenics approach to this question, right? This human being that's developing in the womb obviously isn't up to your standard of perfect, and thus let's dispense with it. And as you point out, it's even immoral not to abort that child. So it's in complete defiance of the facts. 99% of parents who have a Down syndrome child say they're very, very happy. 99% of polled Down syndrome people say they're very, very happy. So when Richard Dawkins talks about quality of life, he's clearly not talking to the people he said should be aborted. And further to that, only 4% of parents who have had a Down syndrome child say they would reconsider if they could go back to that time when they were pregnant. So he really doesn't know what he's talking about.
No, and this is where it gets rather bizarre, even more so, because we're talking about something that is, as you mentioned, very close to eugenics. I mean, we're dealing with one of the most discriminated against groups for abortions, apart from females, around the world. Many doctors are encouraging it. Now we have him who doesn't really have the authority to speak on moral matters, given that he seems to not really believe there is such a thing as morality anyway. But it to me, it's so shocking that even people who are supportive of a woman's right to choose an abortion draw the line at sex-selective abortion, but not Down syndrome selective abortions. I don't get why that is.
Well, it's quite interesting because Richard Dawkins is taking a much harder line than most of the pro-choice people I debate with would even take. Sex selection abortion and, the targeting of Down syndrome children for abortion, and that happens at a rate of about 90%. These questions are troubling to most pro-choice people, and even though it might not dent their belief in the so-called right to abortion, it does stop and make them think about what this procedure is being used for, which is weeding out, people with Down syndrome, weeding out girls, weeding out babies with all sorts of defects or disabilities. So he wrote a follow-up, a so-called apology, which wasn't an apology, where he said, a woman can do whatever she wants, but then reiterated that aborting the child with Down syndrome was, in fact, the moral choice. And it's important to remember that Dawkins himself is, quite outside the realm of most of his fellow atheists on this. one of his close colleagues, Christopher Hitchens, was outspokenly pro-life before he died. So it's not all atheists are crazy like Dawkins.
Yeah, and the Christopher Hitchens one is an interesting comparison because the two of them, in terms of their level of notoriety for critiquing faith, they were both relatively on par, but Christopher Hitchens, as he's written about, only very narrowly avoided being aborted himself.
Right, and it's kind of interesting because, as Christopher Hitchens points out, the pro-life position is worth considering simply because of the science that both of them claim to believe in so strongly, right? As I was debating with a bunch of Dawkins followers on Twitter, I pointed out, look, this is a scientific question. I believe in human rights. Human beings have human rights, so science needs to tell me when a human life begins, and that's when the human rights apply, when we have a new human being. And all of the followers he had that were debating with me on Twitter sort of trickled away one by one when they realized I wasn't going to, appeal to the Bible or some moral code in my condemnation of abortion, but simply my basic framework of human rights as science reveals the human being to us.
Now, this may not be an answer or a question to which you have an answer, but I'm curious if you do. Is the motivation behind those who abort children with Down syndrome, is it done out of a perceived selflessness? I'm doing this to prevent this child from having to grow up dealing with this, or is it a selfishness? I'm doing this so I don't have to deal with this in my child.
Well, interestingly enough, I think Richard Dawkins reveals to us a lot of the motivation, because if anybody finds themselves pregnant with a child who has Down syndrome, it takes a very, very quick survey on the internet of what the life of someone with Down syndrome looks like, and by and large, as I mentioned that statistic earlier, they're very, very happy. So from a quality of life perspective,
I've met people with Down syndrome who are happier than people without it in many cases.
Absolutely.
And they're working,
absolutely.
They're independent, they're doing a lot of things that people with other diseases that can't be detected in utero are doing.
And that's absolutely the case. And that's why in his so-called apology letter, Dawkins said, most parents wouldn't want to have a child that it's going to take more care and it's going to take more of their attention and will stay in the house longer. And I think Dawkins hits it bang on.
And the problem that I have is that this sets really a dangerous precedent for when science gets to a point that other things can be detected before birth. Like, for example, there's been a lot of discussion on this and speculation on this. Is there a gay gene? If so, what will that mean for abortion? What if autism becomes detected before birth? What if all of these other things become detected for birth? All of a sudden, we're moving to this realm where it's acceptable to, just as he says, keep trying again until you get the perfect baby.
That's absolutely it. We're seeing this new trend of designer babies, I like to call it, where people have a preordained vision in their head of what they'd like their child to look like, and they're just going to get their uterus scraped out until they get the right one. This whole gay gene thing you bring up is a very real problem. There was an article in the Atlantic, I believe it was last year, where a gay writer said if the gay gene ever were to be discovered, most gay children in the womb would be aborted, because while parents grow to accept the fact that one of their children is gay, most parents want grandchildren and therefore are much more likely to want a straight child. And he said this is a problem the gay community needs to face. And I've used this argument even debating with my gay friends. Look, if they ever discover a gay gene, would you be against abortion used to target gay preborn children? I absolutely would. What's your position? So these are very interesting questions to pose to friends who are pro-choice on the other side, who might be very uncomfortable with how the abortion procedure is used to discriminate against people of different orientations, people of different abilities, and so on and so forth.
I've seen, just even in the last few minutes looking on the AM 980 Facebook page, people that have gotten into this very nuanced statement of, oh, well, I think it's wrong to decide or to devalue a life with Down syndrome below that of a life without it. However, the reason doesn't matter. And what do you make of that? Does the reason matter when you're talking about something that is as polarized already as abortion?
Well, for me, of course, my belief is very simple, and that's that human beings are entitled to human rights from the very moment they become human beings, which is fertilization. So for me, whether you're aborting a child because you think it might be gay, because you know it's a girl, because it has Down syndrome, all of these motives lead to the heinous action of tearing a child apart in the womb. At the same time, I think that these examples are very helpful just to show what the abortion procedure leads to, which is, as you point out, people just aborting and trying again until they have the perfect child. So these are real moral quandaries that I think people who support abortion should be considering and should be grappling with.
Well, that's exactly the thing. And I remember it was a few months ago, we were talking about sex-selective abortion, and there was someone who had called in and said, I'm pro-choice, but I believe this is wrong. And my response to that was, I don't think you can really look at that and see much intellectual consistency with it, because you're either for it or you're against it in many cases. And that's what I found fascinating about the Down syndrome component, is how many people who say they're on one side of it, but when it comes down to a question of the child will have Down syndrome, all of a sudden it's, well, I don't know. I mean, that's a bit more difficult. To me, it's not. They seem to be on the same page, because as a parent, you're going to have challenges with your child anyway. Down syndrome was just one of a myriad of issues that could afflict someone in their life. It just happens to be one of the only ones, if not the only one, that can be detected before birth.
Precisely. And one of the reasons these questions are so tough for pro-choice people is because, I debate abortion all the time, and one of the main things people bring up is, it's not a baby, it's a clump of cells. But when we're talking about a girl, when we're talking about abortion because it's a girl, referring to that child in the womb as a girl has already humanized it beyond what the pro-choice crowd is usually willing to admit. We've already given this so-called clump of cells a sex. We know that it's a little girl. We've already given, the so-called clump of cells an identity insofar as that we know this child has Down syndrome. So suddenly we've humanized the preborn child in the womb to the point where the question becomes much more uncomfortable, because they can't fall back on the rhetoric that they're used to using in these different situations.
Yeah, fair enough. I agree completely. Jonathon Van Maren, Communications Director for the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform. Always a pleasure, sir.
Thanks for having me on, Andrew.
All right, we have to take a quick break here. When we come back, taking your calls on this. Is it immoral to carry a baby with Down syndrome to term, as Richard Dawkins has suggested? Or is it immoral to abort based on that condition? Jonathon just said this, and it's frankly very true. I have seen more joy in people with Down syndrome than I have in many other people. And granted, there is a spectrum. I get that. There is a spectrum of severity. But I have seen people with Down syndrome that are riding the bus on their own, that are shopping on their own, that are holding down a job on their own. I've seen them that are happy, that will look at me and smile and say hello because I'm a complete stranger. And I'm not saying that everyone's going to be like that. You're going to find people without Down syndrome that are going to be very similar in that respect. But let's not say that these people are being denied a life by being born. They're having a life. They're going on, and many of them are doing great things with that life. So to say it's immoral to give birth to someone with Down syndrome knowingly is, in my opinion, incredibly irresponsible, and yes, immoral itself. What do you think? Let's talk. 519-643-2222 or 1-866-354-8255. This is the Andrew Lawton Show on AM 980. Stay with us. We're talking about a tweet by known author and professor and atheist Richard Dawkins. Someone asked him, or said to him anyway, I don't know what I would do if I were pregnant with a kid with Down syndrome. Real ethical dilemma. He said, abort it and try again. It would be immoral to bring it into the world if you have the choice. And the ultimate irony, a few people have said this online, I mentioned it earlier on, is that he, as a pro-choice person, is trying to deny people the right to choose to have a child that other people would devalue. Yeah, 90% of children with Down syndrome are aborted. That is a startling number, especially seeing what children with Down syndrome can achieve in their lives. So is it acceptable to do that? Is it acceptable to tell women not to do that? Give me a call. Let's talk. 519-643-2222 or 1-866-354-8255. Mindy, go ahead.
Hi there. Yeah, when I was 20 weeks pregnant with my third child, they found a tumor that in her lung that it had its own supply of blood to her heart and back, and they said that the radiologist said they were going to recommend abortion. Now, he got in trouble for that from the doctors. I now have a 15-year-old child who's healthy and happy, and, well, we could have lost her just because there was a chance she might not breathe when she's born. So these people with Down syndrome, like you say, you don't know how severe it is.
And here's the problem, too, is that you have parents, as you know, that are not going to be as well educated or well versed in medicine as the people making these recommendations. So very susceptible to making a decision just because someone told them it's probably the right decision.
Exactly.
And you've seen now on the other side of this that would have been a huge mistake.
Exactly. And we were at the point where, well, then if she's born and can't breathe, her other organs can go to other children, kind of thing. Well, as soon as her head was out, she was screaming her head off. So.
Yeah, wow. And it's quite, I mean, I'm so glad you shared that too, because a lot of people, they only hear about the other cases where, someone has been told they could do it and they did it, obviously not knowing what was going to happen and not knowing what could have happened. And then you're here to say, hey, well, obviously everyone's situation is going to be different, but you were told to do it, you didn't, and now you have a 15-year-old.
Yeah, she was, there's 3 cases of what she had in Canada.
Wow.
Within a year. They don't know why it happens or anything, but they said if she can't breathe, the radiologist said they're going to recommend abortion. But I didn't do it.
Well, I'm so glad you didn't, and I'm sure that you and your family are approaching it.